Hello, everyone. Welcome to this seventh webinar of this international webinar series on sustainable transport and livability. My name is Professor Ashish Verma. I am a professor of transportation systems engineering at Institute of Science. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to another interesting webinar today by Professor Ernest Ajemang from University of Ghana. And he will be speaking today about navigating exclusion, rethinking public transport for all in Ghana. Before I invite the speaker to start his presentation, I will just run through some introduction about this webinar series and the organizations that are hosting this webinar series. I'll just share my screen. Yes. Um, Basically, this webinar series is being conceived and organized jointly by the Special Interest Group SIG-F4 of World Conference on Transport Research Society, WCTRS, which is on livability and sustainable transport, together with the journal Sustainable Transport and Livability, in short TSTL, that is published by Taylor and Francis, and the International Group on Sustainable Transport and Livability, IGSTL, a new society that was formed last year in June. And it's basically looking at furthering this whole cause of understanding linkages of sustainable transport and livability, of course, in association with IC Sustainable Transportation Lab. Let me just quickly run. So the whole purpose of this webinar series is to foster knowledge exchange and propel the discourse on topics that are related to sustainable transport and livability. And I've already mentioned about the organizers of this webinar series. Typically, we have been doing one webinar every 2 months, but between the last webinar and this webinar, there has been some gap. But hopefully, we'll be able to, patch up and have more regular webinars going further, roughly once every 2 months. And the potential speakers would generally include eminent researchers through invitation and also some selected authors of papers published in the TSTL journal. Just running through the previous webinars, the first one we started with one by Professor Arna Shivkumar from Imperial College London, followed by interesting webinar by Professor Ahmed Al-Ghanedi from McGill University in Canada about 15-minute city concept and how it's being conceived in North American cities. Followed by an interesting third webinar where we had multiple speakers, including Professor Kazuki Nakamura from Mijo University and Professor Pushpa Chaudhary and a research scholar from IIT Roorkee. We then had a very interesting webinar by Professor Roger Wickerman from University of Kent and Imperial College London on rethinking accessibility in a post-pandemic network and a zero world. We then had the fifth webinar by Professor Mangli from Tsinghua University, Beijing, China, on resilient traffic management and control, especially under emergency events. And the sixth webinar on post-car ownership futures by Professor Greg Marston from University of Leeds, UK. So it's been a very illustrious, set of speakers who have spoken and, enlightened us on understanding these linkages of sustainable transport and livability. Just a idea about the SIG-F4, the Special Interest Group of WCTRS. For those who may not know, we are having the next WCTR in Toulouse in France coming 6th July to 10th and July, and SIG-F4 also would be organizing number of technical sessions and special sessions during this. This is co-chaired by myself and Kazuki Nakamura with 26 members that you can see here. Also talking about Sustainable Transport and Livability Journal, that is, published by Taylor and Francis. This journal was launched in November 2023, and it's already produced 2 volumes and currently running third volume. And this journal is basically, this is the editorial board from, with colleagues from all across the world, really leading this whole journal and the quality publications that are coming in. And the journal is looking at all these linkages that we are trying to understand between sustainable transport and different dimensions of quality of life, livability, well-being, etc., as you can see here. Uh, there is a related initiative of starting a World Symposium series that we, begin by having the first World Symposium during June 2025 at ISC Bangalore, India. And this will now happen once every 2 years, biannually, essentially in some part of the world. The next one is happening from 30th March to 2nd April 2027 in Technical University of Vienna in Vienna City, Austria. And I really invite those who are prospective authors and interested delegates to look at the website of WSSTL 2027. The call for paper is currently open for the second symposium of uh, the series. And lastly, talking about the International Group on Sustainable Transport and Livability, this was founded on June 27, 2025, during the validity ceremony of the first World Symposium that happened in ISC Bangalore. And again, these are one can go to the website of this IGSTL, simply typing igstl.org. Along with myself, Professor Aruna Kumar from Imperial College London is the vice president, and we have illustrious board members of the society who will spearhead this whole initiative and also organize the World Symposium once every 2 years. And I'm happy to also mention that Professor Ernest Ajima is also one of the founding board members of IGSTL. I'll skip some of these things. Straight away going to the introduction of the speaker, today's speaker. He is an associate professor in transport geography in the Department of Geography and Resource Development at the University of Ghana. As I mentioned earlier as well, he is the founding executive board member of IGSTL and also member of the steering committee of Transport and Geography Commission of the International Geographers Union. Recognized as a Danida Fellow and a recipient of 2017 China-Ghana Urban Development Forum Award. And his research expertise include travel behavior analysis, informal and shared mobility systems, ride sharing, etc., equity, social justice, and transportation. And of course, he has published and produced, quite a lot of quality journal, research papers in his journey so far. So, with this short introduction, I now invite our esteemed speaker, Professor Ernest Ajima, to kindly begin his webinar. Please go ahead.
Yes, thanks so much, Ashish. Let me just put up my slide, just a moment, and then we could start.
While the slides come on the screen, I just want to mention to all the participants that there is a Q&A tab on the top that you would see in the app, where you can type your questions related to the presentation that the speaker will make, and we'll take up those questions towards the end. Please do not put your questions in the chat box. Rather, please put your questions in Q&A tab. Yeah, we can see your screen, Professor Ernest.
All right, please sure. Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending on where you are listening to. Thank you so much, Ashish, for the warm introduction. So in terms of this moment, I think I need to get my slides. Okay, good. Right, so in terms of today's presentation, I would like to take you through some brief background as to what motivated this particular study, what we sought to achieve, and then how we went about conducting the study. With that, I'll give you some brief background. The context is very key because that would actually help us make sense as to the data that we are going to discuss. And again, I do appreciate that we have a number of international members in our audience, so it'll be very great for me to give feedback on the context as well as the methodology, which I will be very brief, and then I'll spend some time presenting some of the very key findings that we did make years ago when we did some research on a particular subject of interest, which I want to share with you. Then I would conclude, give an overview, and then we all reflect and then make room for Q&A. So one may want to ask, what really motivated this study? Well, I'm happy to say that this morning I had opportunity to travel from Medina, where I stay, to University of Ghana, where I come to eke out a living, where I come to work on a daily basis without sweat, without stress. Just like many of you, transport facilitates education, access to education, to healthcare. If you want to visit your office or you want to go to the market, it actually ensures social participation. It allows for everyone in the city to be included. Well, that is not for everyone, I must say. You know, the unfortunate fact is that within our public transport space, there are some people for whom venturing out on a daily basis is a nightmare experience. It's like you're rolling a stone up a hill. For instance, if you're a female and you find yourself, unfortunately, during peak hour travels, you would appreciate what I'm talking about within public transport space, the unwelcome touches, and of course, if you're also a person with disability, it can be a nightmare experience. And so I want for us to mirror in or zoom in a little bit on persons with disabilities. And one may want to ask, why does it even matter? Why do we have to spend some time this morning discussing about persons with disabilities? Well, it has been pointed out by the World Bank Group in 2026, just this year, that globally there are about 1 billion people who live worldwide with one form of disability or the other. Interestingly, 174 countries have signed on to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So basically, the UN wants to ensure that we have a safe, we have an equitable, we have a just space for everyone, irrespective of your abilities to overcome space, to move from point A to point B. Now, within Ghana specifically, Ghana has, in recent times, the statistics indicate that Ghana has roughly about 2 million persons with disabilities. That's 8% of the total population as of the last count. And so Ghana has come up with the Persons with Disability Act of 2006. And the idea is to promote, have a legal framework to make it easy for persons with disabilities to also move about with dignity and with some sense of pride and, you know, as equal citizens with the rest of the country. Unfortunately, studies upon studies have pointed out that in all the various sectors that we have, one of the areas where we have where we have less accessibility, I mean, less inclusion, is that of accessibility. How do we get people who are, you know, with some disabilities to move from point A to point B has become one key sector. And again, if you could see the picture I've just shown, you could see a woman with crutches trying to access the popular trotro, which is a minibus paratransit popular transport in Accra, in Ghana. So this should, you know, serve as alarm bells or should serve as red flags for us. But just in case I've not succeeded in getting you convinced, that's why we need to have this conversation. Well, let me then give you a shocker. Did you know that everyone here, you and I, we are just one fatality, one trauma, one accident away from becoming disabled? Did you know that? Well, don't take my word for it. You can perhaps speak with this former president of Ghana, former President John Agyekum Kufuor, who reportedly recently said that I never would have believed that I would be in a wheelchair in more recent times. And so what I'm saying is that this is a shared destiny for all of us. And so we need to have that conversation. And so it's against that backdrop that our study sought to systematically investigate the whole spectrum of public transport choices that PWDs, persons with disabilities, make, as well as what really influences their decisions to take one mode over the other. And our work is positioned within the framework called the life course theory, which is attributed to the sociologist, the American sociologist Glenn Elder Jr. And basically, his argument is that we all transition through different phases in life. And whichever phase that you may find yourself will have an impact on you as you navigate the course of life. And so within our conceptualization, our point is that transport inequalities accumulate over the life course. So depending on your current situation, depending on your past, it can influence how your future mobility issues emerge. Also, mobility disadvantage is spatially and socially constructed. So often, depending on where you stay, depending on your on your location with the social structure, you may have some advantages or disadvantages within the spectrum of things. And also, mobility agencies may constrain the decision making of PWDs. So, I will be not so constrained because, quote unquote, I'm able to drive from point A to point B. But for the kind of constituents we're going to discuss, but for persons with disabilities, one of the key issues that they have to go through is deliberate prior thinking, the whole mental decision making before they venture out into the public space. Now, one may want to ask, so where did this study, where was it conducted? What's the context? And in terms of methodology, how did you generate data points? So I've put on your screen, you'd see a map of the world. You find Africa. Africa is somewhere in the middle of the map. And then when you zoom in a little bit to your right, you see Ghana. Ghana is located in the western borders of West Africa. So it's within West Africa. And within Ghana itself, we chose to focus attention on two of the largest metropolitan areas, the Greater Accra metropolitan area, which is home to about some 5 to 6 million inhabitants, the most urbanized, Accra, the national capital. And you also have Kumasi. Kumasi is the second largest urban conurbation in the city. Within these two cities, just like you have such large numbers staying there, you also have large population of PWDs. And so we felt that since this is the most populous regions in the country, there's a need for us to spend some time talking to people. Again, in terms of transport opportunities, the varieties, we could actually explore this in depth if we were to spend some time within this study location. Let me also point out that we decided to interview a number of persons with disabilities. Thankfully, we liaised with a number of associations that cater to their welfare, including the Ghana Blind Union and then the Society of Persons with Disabilities. And the idea was to sit them down, allow for them to speak, tell their own lived experiences. I mean, it's one thing to go out there with some questionnaire and ask them to fill, tick for you. And another thing to just allow them, give them the space to narrate their whole life experiences with you. Now, to summarize, the data points in total, we had quite a number of interviews with 40 PWDs, including those who are physically impaired, those who are visually impaired, and other forms of disabilities. In terms of age, the mean age was around 51 years. So the youngest within a sample was 25, and the oldest was 70 years. So on average, you are looking at age of about 51. Most of them were found, so we try to see the geographic variations. Within the urban environment, we spent time in Accra, and then within the rural settings, we spent some time within some rural areas within the Kumasi enclave. Now, what did we find? What did we find? So the very first one that I am going to share with you is that mobility opportunities for persons living with disabilities are shaped by where you find yourself. So the where question, the geographic question of where you find yourself is quite key. Our data suggests that when you come to Accra, to the left on your screen, within the urban environment, there are fewer 2-3 wheelers. So we call it auto rickshaws in India, but in Ghana, we call them pragya. We have fewer of them that our respondents actually rely on when they want to move from point A to point B. Meanwhile, there are quite a number of minibus operations, the trotro, we call them trotros, or the matatus in East Africa, right? So we do have the minibuses and a lot of taxis and also ride-hailing services. So Uber, Bolt, Yango, they're quite important when it comes to the decision of persons with disabilities to move from point A to point B. Now, when it comes to the rural settings, we saw a variation. There seems to be a lot more emphasis on the use of 2-3 wheelers among persons with disabilities. But there were fewer access to taxis, to shared popular transports like the minibuses, as well as the emerging ride-hailing services. Now, with that said, one 31-year-old female who uses crutches actually said that, and this fellow is coming from the Ashanti region, one of the rural areas, and her argument is that there are only a few rickety mini buses here. When we ask us what options they have when they have to move from point A to point B, and so we rely heavily on pragya and Okada. So Okada is the two-wheelers, the motorcycle, commercial motorcycle services. And then Pragya, as I explained earlier, are the auto rickshaws. Now, the second point that I want to share with you is that the mobility experiences of PWDs are not static. Actually, they vary. And they evolve across the entire life course. So as we age, as your level of disability progresses, even as your ability to engage in physical activities shift, as well as your economic conditions shift, somehow they also have to adjust in order to meet the exigencies provided them when it comes to moving from point A to point B. And so, for instance, according to a 61-year-old male who uses crutches in Accra, getting into a trotro is not difficult. And so I've just put at the top of the screen, if like something like a legend, so you could see how the Pragya looks like, how the Okada looks like, how the trotro looks like. We allow them to speak in their own informal diction so that we could capture the nuances of the everyday lived experiences. So I felt for the sake of the international audience, I should put up this so that it will help you to make meaning of what I'm trying to communicate. And so, according to this 61-year-old male crutches user, getting to a trotro is not very difficult for me. Now, I'm retired and I've aged on. And so I need a vehicle for lower ground clearance, he says. Now, when I talk to this 47-year-old male who also uses a wheelchair in Accra, with my condition as a wheelchair user, I can't mount an Okada. I cannot be on a motorcycle, he says. And so the only option will be to rely on vehicles that have low floor or low clearance. Now, when you speak with this 46-year-old female with visual impairment, she says, I prefer the taxi, but I can't always pay. And so I have to rely on Pragya instead because I cannot afford. I can only afford the Pragya. Also talk to this 51-year-old female crutches user in Ashanti region in a rural setting. She says, previously, when my spine condition was not that severe, I managed Okada. I could sit on the motorbike, but now I can only resort to Pragya to help me overcome space, one location to the other. And so as I've just narrated, you could see people with varying age issues, varying levels of disabilities, and how they make different choices given their circumstances. Now, the third point I want to share with you is that when it comes to negotiating the space, with all that I've narrated previously, they have to go through a lot of constraints. But the question would be, are they not resilient? How do they cope? How do they overcome space? And we made some interesting observations. So one point is that they have to now tolerate unsafe and risky situations so they could overcome space. What you and I, perhaps able-bodied people, quote unquote, would take for granted. For them, they have to just endure or cope with the situation. And so when you talk to this 50-year-old male crutches user, he says that the only times I joined Okada was when trotro services were scarce in town. It was uncomfortable and risky, but it took me home anyway. If you talk to this 56-year-old male, he says, well, I don't like using Okada because it can get scary. So imagine someone who is visually impaired and you are a pillion rider. You could just imagine the experience. And so he concludes, I don't have a choice. And that should also raise red flags. That should also get us to think, right? Now, if you talk to this 51-year-old female with also visual impairment in Ashanti, she says, well, I usually use the Pragya here in Asutrin. Asutrin is a small community, village community in the Ashanti region. However, when it's about to rain, I just have to pay extra for a taxi service because I cannot stand in the rain and get beaten by the rain. Now, what we also observe is that they also do a lot of prior arrangements. Sometimes, like this 55-year-old woman with visual impairment said, she says that, well, I have taken the numbers of the Pragya operators, right? I keep them with me. So whenever I'm about to step out, I call them about 30 minutes to alert them, to notify them that, hey, I want to step out, I want to go out, so that when they are passing within my area, then they would remember to pick me up. Again, that informal arrangement between a potential passenger and the service provider, something we should also take very critical note of. And this has been said again in the literature, studies done by earlier authors like Odame, who did some studies among persons with disabilities, actually found out that they actually negotiate ahead of time, right? And aside that, they also try to switch different modes so that they can stay within the constraints placed on them. Now, within that same difficult environment, they also negotiate with the help of assistance that they may receive, sometimes relying on their personal mobility aid. So you would see this 32-year-old visually impaired man who stays at one of the rural settings in Accra at Botiano. He says that my white cane always helps me. So whenever he's moving, he just move it side by side so that once it is clear, there are no obstructions to movement, then I can move confidently, he concludes. Now, if you talk to this 41-year-old woman who also is a visually impaired, she says that some of the mates help me. And it's quite fascinating. She says that they help. So the mates are the driving crew, those who support the drivers, right? These are mostly males. And she says that they help, quote unquote, by holding me. Again, I want you to imagine someone who is blind, who cannot see, and a male, perhaps a young male, is trying to help him by holding. It might be seen as help. In some areas, it might be seen as unwelcome, inconvenient touches here and there. And so they direct me to get a place to sit. Sometimes the men pay for me. Again, that's very interesting. Why would men pay for me? Am I that vulnerable? Couldn't I have paid? But for the fact that I'm blind, but for the fact that I'm a woman, why are they doing this? Is it a favor? And it's something for us, all of us, to reflect. And the drivers also sometimes waive the fares on certain trips for me, she says. But one thing you also observe, if you look to the right side of the screen, you would see people navigating using all sorts of aid. But we found this in Mankranso, in the Ashanti region. The public transport operators, the trotro operators, have built in, this improvised steps that persons with disabilities can actually use to help them as a board. So it's a whole improvised system that has been done by the service providers. Well, just in case you thought, well, Ghanaians are, the traveling public operators, strangers are ultra kind. Well, wait until you hear the 51-year-old female who lives with scoliosis. She tells a story that passengers typically, when I travel with my husband, they prefer to sit, sometimes close to my husband, but because of my condition, they shift away from me. And due to that, nowadays, I travel less. That's her experience. Now, with that said, I want us to now reflect on everything I've said and how this impact on social and policy justice. I've already made a point that we all want to overcome space. We all want to do this effortlessly. I've already said that I came to the office to work. Perhaps you're also seated at some location, enjoying this lecture, and somehow transport facilitated that. But imagine if you were living in an environment where you have limited accessibility. How do you access healthcare, right? It will be delayed, or sometimes you even have to miss your appointment. How does that impact on their livelihoods? You could just imagine that we are able to move as quote unquote able-bodied. But what about those who are unable or disabled? What about their social life? Now, this woman tells us that now she's minimized the number of times she now travels outside. So that would mean that if there are social, avenues for social interaction, she's curtailed or she's minimized or she's restricted. How does it promote independence, right? So you have people helping you, holding you, as it were, to get a seat, as that woman narrated. Young people that ordinarily you would have avoided, but given your circumstances. And so when we talk about accessibility for all, these are all issues that we need to reflect on. And also, if people are going to withdraw from public transport because it's unsafe, they fear getting hurt or getting harm on the way. Again, look at the financial burden put on them. We've already mentioned that their livelihoods are limited. And to think that sometimes when it's raining, you have to pay extra so they can board a taxi, as opposed to using, if like very affordable ones like the Pragea or, the Okada, then it should also get us to talk, right? And to reflect. What about the sheer lack of accessible infrastructure? Not long ago, Ghana, in Accra, for instance, we've built a number of fanciful footbridges for pedestrians to use. But believe you me, there is no way that even for some of us as able-bodied people are willing to use that because of the sheer length, the number of steps you have to climb so they can cross from one side of the road to the other. So even for able-bodied people, it is a nightmare experience. So not to talk about persons with disabilities. What about a negative social experience, the stigma, right? That woman with the scoliosis and the stigma that comes with it. The whole idea that people see you and they want, the whole idea that people are staring at you. can be a whole experience that I don't think any of us would even want to wish on our enemies. But unfortunately, that is a sad reality for a majority, at least for Ghana, 2 million of our inhabitants. How do you overcome space? Now, how does this translate into equal citizenship? We talk about, all of us being equal citizens, but obviously could see that unequal access would restrict opportunities and access to relevant critical services. What about participation, right, for civic and social activity? The bottom line is that it actually reduces the sense of citizenship or the welfare, the well-being of users of the road space, of the public transport space, raising issues with social justice. Now, what is the way forward, one may ask? And I'm going to present this as perhaps my last but one slide, so that we give enough room for all of us to nibble on what I've just presented. How do we proceed? It's one thing to shed tears for them. It's one thing to commiserate with them. It's one thing to sympathize with their situation. But it's another thing altogether to put in adequate measures to address it. How do we ensure inclusive transport reforms, right? How do you do that? And I have at least 3 pillars or 3 pathways I want us to consider. I'm thinking that the Ministry of Transport, that is responsible for policy and standards, must be up and doing. We already do have the laws, but getting the right strategies that would encourage PWDs to assess transport services needs to be relooked again. Now, the Ministry of Local Government, Chieftaincy and Religious Affairs is responsible for, it's like the avenue, the agency of state that's responsible for organizing public transport, right? So a lot of the public transport space, the terminals, they're under the control of the Ministry of Local Government, and they work, they pretend upon the metros, the district assemblies, right? That's the city authorities, right? And so the whole structure about the public transport space is also very important, and their role is quite critical. How do they ensure that they get special attention and ensure that all the laid down bylaws are complied with? That someone must do that. Some of the power must do that. What about the Driver and Vehicle Licensing Authority? Again, we have issues of compliance. So we have, as part of the act that has been promulgated with respect to promoting the welfare of persons with disabilities, it is said that at least one space should be reserved for persons with disabilities within a public transport space. But as to whether that is being complied with, we have no idea. And so how is the DVLA keep renewing licenses of, roadworthiness of vehicles when we've not been assured that persons with disabilities are being, their needs are being catered for? What about the Ghana Standards Authority? They ensure standards. And so what role do they have to play? It's also very, interesting that we need to reflect, because if the laws are there, they need to now come up with relevant standards that would ensure that persons with disabilities are not left behind. The second pillar I would like to comment on is on the transport service providers themselves. So thankfully, I mentioned that when we go to Mankranso in the Ashanti region, we saw that the operators, the unions at the station, they have managed to improvise, giving some steps that could help persons with disabilities. Let's say, persons who are physically disabled, which is a plus for them. But in addition to that, we think that we should have enough driver training and awareness creation. I think all of this is based on the lack of awareness that these are also people who need to move from point A to point B. It's the lack of awareness that mobility or movement is an inalienable right. It's a right of the citizen, right? And so a lot of training, and this can be done by going through the leadership of the various unions. In Ghana, the largest of the transport operator unions is called the Ghana Private Road Transport Union, GPRTU. Their leadership could liaise with some of the disability associations to create the needed awareness, right? The needed awareness, and that's quite important. Service protocols in terms of treating human beings with dignity. Time did not allow for me to share, and a lot of the horrible stories that were recounted to us. But there were instances where one person, blind, her argument is that sometimes they will shout on you when you are taking time to sit. And by that, she was referring to the trotro operators, the drivers, as well as their mates or their attendants, those who help them with their operation. So we need to have a look at that. How do we adapt the vehicles? These are mini, vans. In Europe, we have instances where we are using bigger buses, high occupancy. You can reserve the few spaces behind the driver just for persons with disabilities. And these are clearly marked. You could see that over here, so we do have something like that. But you have private people operating their own means of transport. These are profit-seeking people. These are opportunistic, everyday profit-seeking people. And so if you just leave them on their own devices, chances are that they will not adapt. And that's why the very first point I made about regulations, enforcement is quite critical. Now, one other thing that came to the fore, again, I couldn't share the quote, is that the ride-hailing platforms have also emerged since 2016. They've been with us in Ghana. And within the urban environment in Accra in particular, that's what most of the participants said they rely on. But unfortunately, sadly, some recount their ordeal, that sometimes you book, but as soon as the driver arrives and realizes that you are in a wheelchair or you have crutches, it's like extra load. It will take a lot of time. They will just cancel the trip and leave you. And so we are saying that it's high time that they ended the discrimination. It's high time that we have in-app accessibility tools that would allow people with disabilities of various forms to access public transport. And the idea of refusing services is something that needs to be looked into. If it's possible for the service providers, the companies themselves, to create a mechanism where we could report the experiences, as they allow for us to review after the trips. I think it should also be possible for them to allow for persons who have had such a very raw deal, a very unfortunate experience in the hands of service providers to, as it were, do the right thing. And then the last pillar I want us to consider, I want us to reflect on, is on the infrastructure itself. I have said that we have built footbridges, for instance. Pedestrians, even able-bodied pedestrians, are struggling to use the footbridges. And that becomes an extra burden, if like rolling up a stone up a hill for the PWD. So I think that we need to expand beyond the urban areas. So a lot of the investments into physical infrastructure, expansion of roads in Ghana, for instance, from 2019 up until 2023, we declared them as years of roads. We are building more roads. We are expanding capacity, but it's more centered within the urban areas. What about the rural areas? How do we think to promote equitable and just mobility if we are leaving some people behind? And then the road quality also needs to be relooked at the various terminals. The facility should be accessibility friendly, right? Waiting areas for PWDs should also be given a second look at. And all of this boils down to the finances, right? Government should be able to incentivize the private sector in particular to see how best it could help, because it's coming at an extra cost. And if you just allow an individual operator, somebody who has invested into his own public transport, to go out there and to decide that I want to, do this extra just because I need to be a patriotic, I need to be a sympathetic operator, chances are that this won't fly. So by all means, we need to have some levels of financial support in one way or the other. Now, just in case everything I've said doesn't seem to make sense, or you think these are far-fetched ideas, or you think, well, we have other developmental challenges, why not think about water? Why not think about our poor access to electricity? Why not think about, everyday issues for everyone? People are all struggling. Why not? There are several developmental challenges that confront Ghana and indeed the rest of the global south. But just in case that is what you're thinking, I just want you to have a look at this picture again. I just want you to reflect the earlier point I made, that it is a common destiny that we all share, and that indeed we are just one trauma away, we are just one accident away, and in this moment we are all also rendered disabled. And so just like the former president, who has now become an advocate for persons with disabilities pursuing their mobility needs, I think it's something that we should have a conversation. I'm very happy that we have this platform where we could engage, share ideas on how to get this going beyond just mere rhetorics. So thank you for doing the listening. And let me conclude by crediting my former PhD student and now my colleague, Dr. Dominic Edem Hoto. He graciously shared or allowed me to present this as part of his PhD on the theme accessibility and use of public transport services by persons with disabilities, which he successfully defended at the University of Ghana. So I was part of this advisory team. So when I got the invitation to present I talked with him and he graciously shared, gave me the right to utilize some of the data points so that I could share with you, take your feedback to help improve the discourse. And also, we're also grateful to the Ghana Blind Union. I think they also gave their time to contribute to this study. The Association for persons living with disabilities in Ghana, also credit them. And so with that said, Ashish, I think I hand over back to you. I wanted to make it as crisp, as short, and stay within time so that we can have feedback, very relevant and critical feedback, so as to move people, irrespective of their disability category, move them from point A to point B. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Ernest Ajiman. I must say it's a very interesting study, a study on a very important topic, which sometimes we don't associate ourselves with. But as you rightly pointed out, that all of us are just one accident away from becoming PWD. So I think that really reminds us that this is not something other than us, but it's all of us, and our own needs. Even if we don't get into an accident, but by the time we become older, we would face similar challenges as you have described today. And so it's better that we all make attempts to see that provisions and planning for the needs, mobility and accessibility needs of PWDs should be mainstreamed in all aspects of transport, whether it is transport planning, traffic management, and mobility services, and so on. So I again congratulate you for a wonderful work, and credit to your former student who is now your current colleague for doing a wonderful work. To the audience, please type your questions in Q&A tab so that we can take it up. I can already see some questions, so I will first start taking those questions with Professor Ernest Ajiman. First question is, when resources are limited, how do we ensure equity while also building the system's long-term resilience? How should we prioritize how the priorities change? Yeah, basically. Yeah.
All right, so that's a good question. Someone said resources are not, they become. We decide where we want to put the resources. And interestingly, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, somehow we managed to obtain resources because we saw that that was an existential threat. So for me, I think that the idea is, first of all, to acknowledge that this is a problem, right? We all need to not see them as the other segments of society, but that is just a reflection of something which could happen to any one of us. And that for me will then, yes, of course, I do agree that in the global south, in the poor countries, we have a lot of issues, right? And so resources are limited. But my question would be, how did we manage to respond to COVID-19 with that agency? And so that for me should give us food for thought for us to reflect beyond the rhetorics, beyond being signatories to some UN convention or some laws or what have you. I think the idea is to see this as an existential threat for all of us, and that will help us to then have the basis to generate resources to do this, because it is something that is only waiting for you and I.
Yeah. Thanks. So the next question is, how should we measure transport success? By the number of people moved, or by the ability of most vulnerable groups to travel independently?
That's also very interesting. I'm not even sure if it was supposed to be an either or. One, I would agree, by the number of people who move. So for instance, in Accra this morning, if like I will typically do, sometimes I park my car, I just go to the roadside, try to use trotro, and it's very interesting. So I'm just a few meters away from campus, from the University of Ghana where I work. And typically the trotros will pass in front of the university before it goes to the center of town. But the trotro drivers would insist that even though I'm going to take the very first leg of the journey from home to my office, they insist that I have to pay from my home if pass my office to the CBD, else you don't join. They will not allow you to join the trotro. And so sometimes it's very funny, it's very interesting. You see, and it's very sad, I must say. You have a lot of people, stranded commuters, waiting for trotros that never come. And when they come, they decide who comes on board or who doesn't board. And so I would imagine a livable city where you have more people getting access to transport from, especially within the peak hour period, from point A to point B. But with that said, I also think that given that we are all vulnerable and that one day we may also be persons with disabilities, I also think that I see that successful transport system that takes on board everyone. And so for me, I don't think the response should be either or. Do we have quantity versus quality? Do we have volumes versus equity or fairness? It should be on the same weight. That's how I would like to see it.
Next question is, to what extent does a temporary physical injury induce a long-term behavioral shift from public transport to private vehicle reliance post-recovery? And is this disruption accounted for in current decision choice frameworks?
Yeah, so it's very important. So yes, temporarily we may have some disability of a sort. When we spoke to our respondents, initially when it started, it wasn't like this. It wasn't this severe. And now it is severe, so I now have to adjust. I think I read one of the interview quotes. So basically, if it is something that we could manage, and by the way, all of us here, so-called able-bodied, we all live in one form of disability or the other. And so, of course, we try to adjust. But given that is going to be a long-term issue, disability, then that's when the conversation becomes even more critical. What measures do we put in place? So just in case I'm now unable to bear or cope at a personal micro level, how does the macro, how does the society, the environment I live in, how does it respond? And so I think it needs to be factored into everyday conversation based on the data that we have generated. People may cope, but to some degree. And so it's very important that we make room for the long-term investment so that if people are unable to do it on their own, the society must hold them by the hand and support them.
The next question is, how do we guarantee safety of women and children who use ride-hailing platforms in cases where drivers may use foul language or maybe drop women in unsafe locations or take unfamiliar routes? The issue is the limited scope of controlling what route a ride-hailing driver takes, or follows. So, how do we handle and tackle this issue?
Yeah, thank you, Ashish, and thank you to the questioner. I think it's also very, very interesting. So yes, there are rules that govern human dignity. I just mentioned the Act 2006, which protects persons with disability. So there's a law, right? So this question would be, how is that we're unable to implement the provisions of the law? And so that then takes us to, what role does the police have to do with this? There are instances where we've had people complain or reporting on if like some of the poor treatment meted out to them by the ride-hailing operators. I'm not sure the internal mechanism and how the companies respond. But just in case one decides to escalate the issue and to report to the police, maybe you are a woman, you've been abused, you are a person with disability, you've been abused. How do you ensure that your rights are protected? There are a number of NGOs and legal firms that do pro bono services that I'm aware. They partner with the Blind Union, the Physically Challenged Association. So I think at that level, it's very important that we promote that agenda so that law firms or institutions that protect such vulnerable groups must be promoted. In terms of raising the issue up, sometimes when cases are reported, there's a lack of follow-ups. And so in Ghana, we call it becomes a foolish case. The case dies a natural death because imagine you're a person with disability. Already, I've mentioned that their livelihoods are restricted. I've mentioned they do not have a lot of cash on them. And if you need to go through the full gamut of the arm of the law is very, very long and it's very slow. It takes its own time. It commands resources. It's not until we have this, if like private law firms or what have you, legal people offering pro bono services, their laws will, their rights will continue to be infringed upon, unfortunately, with impunity.
So next question, of course, it's I would say, it's clear. If public transport remains inaccessible to persons with disabilities, can we say that principles of inclusive urban development is being achieved?
No, I
Yes.
disagree that with yes, it's just a mere rhetoric. And interestingly,
Yeah.
we are a country, just like I'm not sure, so well, politicians are quick to sign on. We are part of the 174 countries that have signed on to the convention. But if it becomes only a lip service, and it's quite interesting. So I'm very conflicted to hear the former president who had all the power to have made provisions for persons with disabilities and never did. And now he's now saying that, well, I never imagined it would happen to me one day, but he had all the power back in the days. And those are some of the critical comments I read from people when this news broke, that he had actually lamented about how now he's also handicapped and somehow society, of course, he's a rich man, well positioned. He sits in, if like an automatic wheelchair. But as we've seen in this study, there are many people who cannot afford this luxury, right? And so those who have the power need to make it count. Else, we all pay the price for it.
That's important. Now, the next question is in reference to your slide number 16, which is on the screen. How do we know whether these reforms are genuinely reducing exclusion rather than simply improving compliance with accessibility standards?
Okay, so I must say that since 2006, we have these agencies there. But to think that now we're having a conversation today, 17th June and 2026. So between 2006 and 2026, that's about 20 years on. To think that we have the occasion to even start saying that let's do this means that the laws and the agencies really haven't lived up to expectations. That is granted. That's, for me, that's what I could infer. And so, yes, we do have the laws, we do have the agencies, and perhaps they're also doing their best given the constraints. Because if you spoke with them, we did some interviews with some of the state agencies, the Ministry of Transport in particular. But the bottom line will be that they're also constrained, and so somehow we all look the other way, and then we all play the ostrich as if the problem doesn't exist. But indeed it does exist, as I've highlighted in the presentation.
The next question is about long-term planning. What consideration needs to be prioritized in long-term planning so that system remains desirable or basically accessible to all sections of society?
Exactly. So planning, I mean, once we admit there is a challenge, that's the first one. So planning begins from not just the engineering bit, and I think that's something that I need to comment on. We are very good at the hardware, but the software is something that is really lacking. I mean, take for instance the footbridges that we built in Accra. Certainly, the government has had good intentions. Let's build footbridges. People are getting knocked down from fast-moving vehicles when they are crossing. So let's separate them physically. Let's build footbridges, and then lo and behold, we do build footbridges, but without recourse to the needs of people, the cultural sensitivities of people. And so, beyond just providing the infrastructure or the hard structures, I think the soft structures are quite important. First, let's admit that there's a need. Why do we even plan and not consider them? Do we even have this conversation without they sitting with us on the table? And I recall last night I had a very, healthy talk with my colleague Dominic. We're discussing how to present this, and I'm not sure if Dominic we succeeded, but I asked for him to see if we get one of the generous participants who took partner survey. So we sit within academia, we speak big English, esoteric terms are used, we share ideas, we get all the likes, we go. But how's that we're discussing about PWDs and they're not here? That's even a criticism of the whole system that we have set up. So the bottom line is that we need to find ways to engage them. And I'm happy to say, let me just digress briefly. Not long ago, I partnered with some consultants to work for the government of Ghana on passing the national electric vehicle policy. And as part of that document preparation, we actually met the Association of Persons with Disabilities. And that's when I got to know that actually 16 different types of disabilities in Ghana. And so we're very blessed that they came in their numbers, they shared their frustrations and how they feel we should incorporate their unique issues into the new EV policy that we're rolling out. And so what I'm saying is that we can borrow a leaf from that experience and to say that we cannot plan without them. And that would actually help us not only to think about the hardware, but the software as well.
The next question is, how can transport planners involve people with disabilities when designing new bus terminals and other related infrastructure instead of just guessing what they need?
So I think that point was exactly what I said earlier on. So it's a lot of guesswork. The engineers know their book. They've gone to school. They've learned how to build from point A to point B. That's okay. They can do that. But they do not design without talking to me. And so currently, when you come to Accra, we have this funny arrangement where we've built the footbridges. Now, the city authorities have employed able-bodied young men with canes, with whips, to beat people if they choose to jaywalk and not go and use the footbridges. And so imagine the extra cost in trying to police a solution. You've built footbridges, people are not using them, the people are still crisscrossing, and now the city authority now punishes people physically, instant justice for if I use that word, so they can go and use the footbridges. And it's all because yes, we build infrastructure without recourse to people's need. They're very need. And how do you get to know my need if you are only assuming for me, if you don't talk to me?
We still have good number of questions. I think your presentation has generated quite a lot of interest. Let me pick up. Hopefully, we can probably take some more extra time if required.
Okay.
If you don't have any other engagement immediately.
No, I think it's very exciting. Let's keep going.
So many cities are starting to use transport apps and digital tickets. Will this technology help people with disabilities, or will it just make things harder for them? Quite interesting question.
Very, very interesting, Ashish. I very much believe. So I recall I mentioned that woman who claims she has the numbers, she's blind, but she has the numbers of the operators and can reach out to them. What if this woman now has opportunity to use some of these apps? And indeed, I actually, while preparing for this, I know there are quite a number of apps being built targeting specifically persons with disabilities, even for ride-hailing companies. And so, yes, it will make life a lot easier for them, because even before technology comes in, we do have at least one of our participants who intimated to us that she's relying on her mobile phone to link up between the service provider and herself. And so if we can raise it up to a level where we have apps doing this, that should be fantastic. And I've actually seen a number of PWDs relying on these apps, sometimes voices that will call so he's unable to see, but his phone has smart apps that allows for communication of a sort, and actually helps them to navigate the rather chaotic urban environment that we find ourselves in.
It could be useful. It may also be a barrier. It depends on how do we build these technologies.
Yes.
So next question is about how do physical, economic, and social barriers within Ghana's transport system influence the mobility patterns and quality of life of persons with disabilities?
So basically, quality of life, your sense of dignity, your sense of privacy, your sense of citizenship, everything gets stolen away once you step out into the current chaotic public transport space that I've just narrated. So imagine that woman who needs to be helped, who needs to be supported, who needs to be carried by strangers. I mean, this isn't something that we need to really, really, really imagine so much. I recall last year I was in Nairobi for a conference organized by Flow Initiative, and they fortunately brought one lady student from the University of Kenya who a person with disability. So she came to tell her own experience. A student who needs to move from home to university campus using matatus. It was, I mean, she drove all of us to tears. If I'll not be exaggerating. And so it is an experience that affects their very dignity and sense of identity. That has been clearly demonstrated in this presentation this morning.
Yeah. And next it's an interesting question. If accessibility is a fundamental right, should governments prioritize disabled friendly transport infrastructure over expanding the transport network?
I think, I think again, I become ambivalent when people give either or, because I think we have so many problems that we don't have the luxury of selecting one over the other. Because certainly, providing access, because the question inherent in that question, for me, is a good question, but inherent in that question is, okay, so we need to prioritize. So between expanding networks for the majority versus the few PWDs, that's another way of looking at that question. And for me, it gets back to the picture I still have on your screen. He had the power, he could have done a lot. Of course, one of the finest politicians that we had, a lot of the road expansions that we do have currently in Ghana, we owe them to President John Agyekum Kufuor, without mincing words. But again, well, he prioritized that. He built the most roads. But now, unfortunately, he finds himself among the so-called minority. And so I think that whilst we are promoting expansion of road networks, fantastic. But what if we consider that one day it might also happen to us? So I don't want a situation where we have either or. Let's take everything on board, because every mobility need matters.
This question is regarding the rush hour travel, and it's specifically, using Trotro in the Accra region in the your capital. How easy or difficult it is for the PWDs to cope up with situation and their travel needs, especially during rush hours?
It is a nightmare. I shared my own experience, quote unquote. I think I'm able-bodied, but you should be there between demand and supply. There are so many people who need to use. So Trotro can take on average 15, 18. The majority Mercedes-Benz Sprinter buses can take maximum 18. And typically around peak hour period, because our land use system is also very bad. We've concentrated a lot of the important trip generating points. So where people go to work, where they go to shop, where they go to access government services, are all concentrated in the CBD, the city core. And so and of course, Accra is also sprawled. Kumasi has sprawled. People are living at very distant locations, sometimes 30 kilometers away from their offices. And so it means that we need to all, travel, depend on cars. So imagine when you have fewer cars, and the few ones that we have fewer, carrying capacity. And again, they decide, opportunistically, they decide on the terms of who gets in and who gets out. So imagine finding yourself crowded, and people are pushing and shoving, trying to find a seat, and you are disabled. That won't be a perfect day for you. So I think that with my own experience and the fact that even if you manage to get a seat, they also now decide how much you pay, because ordinarily you're supposed to pay for the distance that you spend on the road. But as I've narrated, they will insist that you're moving from Medina to Legon to come and work, but you have to pay as if you're going from Medina to Accra city center. If you don't pay, again, imagine, for people whose incomes are restricted, you're asking them to pay for the mileage that they're not actually enjoying the service. Again, it raises a number of issues, but and so it got to a point where the government rolled out this social intervention, the Metro Mass Transit. So the government of Ghana has this quasi public bus service called the Metro Mass Transit, roughly taking about 70 passengers at a time, both seated and freely standing. And they made provisions for persons with disabilities. But unfortunately, we have few of those buses compared to the many trotros. And so this opportunistic, undignified treatment will continue to exist, unfortunately.
So the next question, basically ask about what does the government can do to make things accessible for PWDs, whether they should design specialized new vehicles that are only for disabled, or try to improve upon existing vehicles and infrastructure to accommodate them. What is that you think government should do?
So the key word here is social inclusion. I'm not sure how the questioner would feel if you belong to that special group and somehow. So yes, in one breath, it helps to improve on access, but on the other, we should also guard against social exclusion. So why do you do this? Is it because I'm a disabled? Why do you segregate? So we are talking about inclusion. We want to have, and we are all gregarious. We are human beings. We are not made to live in isolation. So yes, it is a good idea. I support to some extent. It may improve access opportunities for them, but the fear will be social exclusion, and that's something that we cannot afford to promote.
Next question is probably from someone who is familiar with your geography. So the question is about the excessive use of traffic lights almost at every junction or point, making it less easier, and difficult, or more time consuming to travel. And when one is traveling to Cape Coast, the number of police stops are also a lot. A truck transporting goods to the core may also be delayed due to all these things. So how do you look at this situation and handle it?
Okay, so basically this one deals with the whole experience of, if like, congestion, for instance, road traffic management, how to ensure easy and convenient and fast movement. Basically, it affects almost everyone in the general populace. But I'm just wondering how that also would impact the PWDs even more. Because to start with, if hypothetically, well, not this is even hypothetical. So assuming you have a lot of traffic congestion building up, what that means is that you have trucks that are stuck on the road. They've not been able to offload passengers and come back to pick those who are waiting. So the longer they stay in traffic, the more people pile up, the more people crowd at the trip origins. And the more becomes even more difficult for persons with disabilities, because you still have a lot more people crowding, right? And so, yes, we need to look at the traffic management system so that we ensure free flow, easy flow, less congestion. That ultimately helps PWDs, because again, you create room where vehicles can move from origin to destination, return back to pick more passengers. And then, of course, our friends and brothers and sisters, PWDs, also get access to the limited public transport provision.
Easy thing to address, but yes, this is what best we can do. This next question is interesting. It's about how communities can help reduce transportation challenges for PWDs. What can they do?
Well, it begins from this community. I see how many 102 people, maybe plus myself, we are community. How do we start the conversation from here? That's very, very important. We live in a university environment. I work in a university environment. There are special provisions made for people with PWDs. Not long ago, I think the media took very interesting notice of one particular student who had a very special need accessing our university block for lectures. Fortunately for us, we have engendered PWDs in our buildings. For instance, you may have not necessarily stairways, but we have, facilities allow for them to still sit in your wheelchair and then be pushed up. What if you want that privacy? And so the media, I recall, supported one particular PWD with automated wheelchair, like what the former president is seated in. And I could see, I've seen him quite a number of times. I've observed that he's actually now having some level of freedom and, if like, dignified ways of moving from his residence on campus to lecture facilities or to academic locations. So the community begins from us. It begins with you. It begins with me. Now, beyond that, perhaps when it comes to the community members expressing their desires for change, maybe that desire is reflected when it comes to voting for people who are, if like, conscious about solving a problem. So if we see this as a problem, I think if President Kufuor were to stand for elections again, and now he knows that's a problem, I think that's something he may want to prioritize. And so together as a community, we talk about it. This platform, fantastic. Your participation, fantastic. But beyond the mere rhetorics and the talk, how do we leave it out? How do we, for instance, sometimes you are driving within university campus, there are PWDs who need to assess. Fortunately, we do have some of them being assisted by their aides. We also have some who are using the cane. And sometimes I marvel. There's this particular one I usually see one elderly man, blind. I'll meet him along, those who know the geography, Achimota school area. It's such a very busy corridor, and this man always walk alone with just his cane. And sometimes I wonder, I marvel how he managed to do that. And maybe beyond sympathy, it should be part of the narrative. It should be part of the conversation. And I think that's where the change begins from.
The other question is about any, successful examples that you can think about or share, which have really made accessible, transportation system for PWDs, which Ghana
Okay.
and other countries can learn from or adopt. Yeah.
Okay, so one I'll mention from our own data is what we saw here in Ghana at Mankranso, where they have improvised on the steps, right, to help some segment of the PWD. So it's something that maybe global South countries can look at to in terms of upscaling. We've seen instances, of course, it's also a function of the economics, people's ability to afford. But we've had instances where, especially in Western Europe, it is mainstreamed. It's mainstreamed. I was reading about this in Ireland, how they've succeeded in actually walking the talk and making sure that all the provisions that they've signed on, the UN conventions they've signed on, are actually actualized. And so, yes, what I can recall is the one for Ghana. I know so I was in Nairobi, Nairobi last year, November, and as I indicate, one of the key issues was the matatus, this highly animated public transport, what we call the trotro. And somehow we understood that they've made provisions based on the feedback that I had. And so maybe that's also a good case. So at least the first seat behind the driver is always reserved for persons with disability. That is when they are available. But again, the question would be, what if they are not available? Who pays for that empty seat? Is a question that begs answer. And so then that might mean that there might be other ways to, if you really want to do this, there may be other ways to incentivize the operators, the public transport operators, to still insist that that seat becomes, if like vacant, because someone's paying for it. But if we have a situation where, well, becomes as it becomes necessary because no one is paying for the empty seat, then it's just a matter of time that the able-bodied and those who can afford will take it away all over from the PWDs for whom it was purposely designed for. And so I think there are a number of interesting solutions preferred all over. And even though the examples I've given may be very micro level, we need to find ways of upscaling them going forward.
Yeah. I think we have a lot of more questions, but I'll just take a couple of more before we end the session. If I leave out some questions, I would, request the person who has asked the question to also maybe later write an email to Professor Ernest. I'm sure you would be able to respond. But I'll just take a couple of more questions. One is does the persistent inaccessibility of public transport in the two cases of Accra and Kumasi that you mentioned suggests that disability issues are treated as a welfare concern rather than a development priority?
I think it's seen as a welfare concern, basically, because that woman who narrated a story that, men, sometimes out of goodwill, support me. Public transport operators, informal service providers deciding that let's do this. Maybe it's for welfare to support PWDs, but maybe it's also to help speed up the loading process, right? So to cut down on the waiting or turnaround times. But really, we haven't seen this as a developmental issue, unfortunately. And once it becomes a welfare issue, you are at the mercy of people and their proverbial hospitality. But if it so happens that, like that woman who has scoliosis, and people choose to be unkind, then of course she's left to the mercies of very unkind people. So that's why we should see this as a developmental issue. We should see this as something that merits national frontline, frontline on national TV or national newspapers for discussions, such that it becomes, if like, a developmental agenda. Because as I keep repeating, it's just one accident away, and we are all in that category of citizens. And so, yes, so far, I think based on the data, it is more of a welfare issue. It's more of people act of their own magnanimity, going all the way out, just be kind to you, but it just doesn't happen all the time. And that's something we should avoid or guard against.
How do you rate the current, level of interventions being done in Ghana and especially in Accra uh,
Mm.
for inclusive, accessibility to PWD? How do you rate the current state of affairs?
Okay. So again, speaking to this data that we have, speaking to the let's about 40 participants. And of course, one may say this is not representative enough because you have Accra, for instance, is home to about 5 million, right? Kumasi is home to about 3 million. So if you just spoke with only 40, a little, I mean, it doesn't represent. So quantitatively, this can be a limitation that people may raise up. But seeing that we allow people to talk, give their own lived experiences, um, we could still infer from this that their views really matter and that it goes all the way to help us appreciate the point. So with the people that we spoke with, and then on that basis, if I were to rate the level of inclusivity, irrespective of the limitation I've mentioned, that it's just people who spoke with, if I were to rate based on their lived experiences, if I were to rate on a scale of 10, I'm not sure I would score as anything above 3/10 based on the 40 plus people that we spoke with, based on the experiences. Though we may refer to all the conventions, then yes, we've passed laws, we've made some improvements, we've made some adjustments, but beyond that, based on the experiences that and you see, it becomes even more. So yes, we are researchers. We're supposed to stay out of the research, allow the data to speak for itself. But it becomes sometimes impossible to avoid if you sit next to a person. The person is narrating his or her ordeal. I'm not sure I can look them in the eye and rate Ghana 10/10. I'm not sure I could do that.
Uh, uh, are there currently any programs that teach, especially the Toto drivers or even Pragya and Okado drivers and conductors, how to treat passengers with disabilities with respect and dignity?
Oh, yeah, I think there was one initiative. I'm just looking for the word. It's escaped me. I know the UN supported, I think, the Ministry for Gender something. It's so gender and social protection. Yes, and with that they launched. Is it 13th or 13th? I've forgotten the initiative, but the idea was to partner with trotro operators. So they visited a number of the trotro terminals, and the idea was to raise awareness. But a number of issues also emerged. The trotro operators complained. I mean, the union leaders complained that, well, for them, they usually do refresher courses for their drivers, but not all drivers actually join the unions. And so for them, they rather push the blame on if like recalcitrant drivers who don't join their unions. And so yes, I've at least had one initiative whereby the idea was to make sure that for all the trotro terminals or the stations we call them, they were made aware, and so that has been done. But the bottom line is that we still do have people who would infringe on the rights of these operators. And so for me, to the extent that we've done that before, it's a plus. It means that we can upscale it. We can do it on a regular basis and not just a day, maybe just to get some nice photos or videos taken by the media. We splash it on front pages and that is it. We all go to sleep.
So I'll just take last two questions. I think this has been an extremely enriching conversation, and I think you have very lucidly and comprehensively answered a lot of these queries, and this has improved our knowledge and understanding of this whole issue of accessibility for PWD. So I'll just take the last two questions. How can Ghana balance affordability and accessibility without compromising service quality? And second, what lessons can Ghana draw from other African cities, especially Nairobi or Lagos?
Okay, so I think one show of doing that is by the state or the government making this a priority by investing in large occupancy buses. We have tried in time past. I mean, so when Dominic wrote his PhD, while I was reading, I got to know that at some point in time, if you were a person with stability and you had some special card, that membership card that they designed, and you need to travel in the state transport company's bus, STC, they were given affordable. I thought literally they were made to pay less or nothing at all if you had that card. At some point in time, we also launched, when the Metro Mass Transit was launched in 2003, one of the services that they provided was free bus rides for children of school-going age. So once you were found in wearing a public school uniform, and persons with disabilities and older persons had free rides. But these were state-sanctioned buses. And so, of course, one will not say, it compromised on quality. They drove safe, they drove reliable services. But unfortunately, in terms of the market share, we don't have a lot more. So I think going forward, we need to have a conversation around how do we get this service that we've tried before. So first of all, what lessons did we learn? Why did it collapse? And seeing that this is an essential threat, how do we get the state to run those services? Secondly, if we leave it in the hands of private people, we won't get so much to achieve. Now, what lessons do we learn from the rest of African countries that have succeeded in doing this? I mentioned about the Kenyan Matatu experience, at least as I got to know, the fact that they insist on getting, at least one seat reserved for persons with disabilities. I'm not sure what the business model is behind that example I'm giving, but in the argument of social justice and inclusivity, is something that Ghana can consider. But we need to really understand who pays for that empty seat. That is, if no PWD comes to occupy that seat.
I wish we could have, taken more questions, but this has been an extremely enriching conversation and quite a good understanding of the complexity behind this whole challenge of universal accessibility. I'm really hopeful that today's webinar and this whole discussion would encourage more such research and studies happening in different parts of the world, bringing better understanding of universal accessibility challenges and hopefully, creating systems that are inclusive for all. With this positive note, I again thank you, Professor Ernest Ajiman, for taking your time and giving a wonderful perspective on a very important and pertinent topic of accessibility for PWDs. We hope that we'll continue this conversation. And to all the participants, please join us next time. Roughly after 2 months, we'll again come back with another interesting webinar by an esteemed speaker. Till then, please keep looking for announcement in the future as we go along. So thank you again, Professor Ernest, for your time and your wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Bye for now.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye-bye. With this, we close the 7th webinar.